everyone, I hope you're well and that the last 2 weeks have been good for you. I'm going to be doing the Bitcoin Aries new moon forecast. So this is going to be the kind of equinox new moon forecast, and I think in a lot of ways it's really, really positive and quite bullish, and I'm going to get into why. I did mention this a little bit in the last forecast, but as I say, I'm going to get into more details shortly. But before I do, I just wanted to address something very quickly. And that is that all the work that I do here on YouTube and on my social media accounts like Twitter is all my own work. I don't kind of take payment or endorse third parties. If I did, I would say so, I would declare it. But there have been some rumors kind of flying around recently suggesting otherwise. So I just wanted to kind of clear that up and make it sort of crystal clear that that everything I do is my own work. I've never been paid in terms of like money, that kind of thing, and I think if I had been, I would probably be a lot wealthier than I am now. But I do my research. I always kind of credit my sources, and if I do ever have any kind of third-party endorsements, I will certainly declare those as I'm supposed to, under things like YouTube guidelines. So I just really want to kind of clear that up, because credibility is really important, and yes, I hope I've kind of drawn a line underneath that now, and we can all kind of move on. But anyway, there's lots of good news to look forward to in this forecast, so let's get into it and see what we've got to look forward to between now and the full moon kind of mid-month. So first of all, I'm going to look at the human design transits and gates, because as I say, this gives us a really lovely flavor for what's kind of going on. And before I do that, I should say that I've looked at three main transits. First of all, the position of the luminaries at the time of the new moon. Then I've looked at Mercury, and that's because Mercury is going to be part of a stellium in Aries with this new moon, so it's going to be quite prominent. And then Uranus as well, and I did talk about Uranus in my last forecast, and I said that it moves quite slowly and it's going to be quite pivotal in the first week of April in terms of potentially sending us to surprise or kind of quite sudden upward swings possibly. So I'm going to look at that position as well. But let's start with the luminaries. So the luminaries are going to be in hexagram 21 line 3, and this is super interesting because this is part of the will or the heart center, and you can see here this red triangle. Now this tends to get activated around about the time of the equinox, and it's so interesting because the will in astrological terms is associated strongly with the planet Mars, and of course Mars rules Aries. And from the northern sort of hemisphere perspective, it's when we have spring, so it's when the sun reaches the equator and we kind of move into spring and then into summertime. So it's a time of gradually we're gaining in light in terms of day length and that kind of thing. And so to me that's a kind of an increase similar to the waxing moon, and on top of that, yes, it's really a kind of a time of kind of an acceleration in the pace of events. Things tend to be quite optimistic, and with the will centers which are on, what's interesting is that it allows people or sort of entities to have more sway when it comes to group dynamics. So it's the center associated most with leadership. So I think it's interesting that the center switches on, because it does give a lot more, as I say, people a lot more agency. And I think over the last few months, with as we move to Pisces season, which tends to be a little bit demotivating often, and things tend to sort of leak. I think that there's definitely this sense of like a resurgence as we kind of move into the solar new year, and people start to feel kind of similar to they do at New Year, at these sort of the calendar new year. So that in and of itself is going to help with investor sentiment. So it's interesting that this particular position, this channel, this gate rather, is part of the channel of money, which extends from this kind of the apex of the triangle here in the will center to hexagram or gate 45 in the throat center, which is of course all about manifesting. So it really is focused on money, money, money. And Richard Rudd talks about this as a move from being controlled or controlling to authority and to valor or courage. And so we really start to get a sense of moving out of fear, which has been very, very prevalent since kind of December, when we first of all had that square, the Saturn square, and the Federal Reserve started tapering in sort of on Wall Street. And that sent a lot of fear in the market, and then it got exacerbated through things like the Russia-Ukraine situation, which created a lot of uncertainty in terms of supply chain disruption, oil prices soaring, etc., etc. Now, we're kind of moving out of that energy as Uranus has turned direct and is moving back into towards a kind of more positive aspect. So I think it's really interesting that we are moving from the sense of being controlled or just feeling helpless to the sense of coming into our authority, which is, as I say, what the will center is all about. And this kind of gives us the courage to take action, to take risks a little bit more, and to move forward. So interestingly, line 3 can be associated with hesitation due to overwhelm. So there's still that little bit of kind of how can I put it, where people are not 100% sure, like, are we sure, like, we're seeing the signs of recovery in the Bitcoin chart. Can we trust this, or is it going to be another fake out? So I think it is important to exercise caution and to to sort of manage your risks. But I think the key thing here is not to get caught up in other people's ego issues, which can affect your levels of commitment. So, other people might have vested interest in sort of having a very bearish scenario, and this can obviously make people doubt their own judgment when perhaps they are seeing bullish signs, bullish kind of indications in the chart and through their technical analysis or whatever it may be, and don't necessarily want to kind of take risks. So I think just something to bear in mind, that it's really a good time to get in touch with your own sense of authority and your own decision-making GPS system, your internal GPS system, because for everybody this is different in human design, and I think really kind of getting in touch with it will help us to make better decisions, and we'll have less fear and doubt around whether we've done the right thing kind of overall. So yeah, but I think generally speaking, with the will center so strong, we are more decisive, and we do tend to take clearer action, which I think is always very helpful. And then Mercury, as I said, is also going to be sort of involved in this particular new moon. So you can see it's in the same hexagram, 21, but it's at a different line. So it's slightly behind the others. The Sun and the Moon are at line 3, and Mercury is still at line 1. So this is about correcting small inadvertent errors to avoid having problems further down the line. So I think this is where the kind of, planning your trading strategy is very important, managing your risk, and all of that can be calculated in advance. So I think it's important to do your homework and to really have your plan, and then stick to your plan when you do come to sort of execute your trades. So, and I think here it's important to beware of a lack of drive or a kind of giving up. We must act with courage and conviction. And as I say, this is very much in keeping with Mars Aries energy, which is all about sort of taking action, focused decision making, and having conviction. So having the sort of the courage of our convictions and carrying through, so that we kind of walk our talk, that kind of thing. And then the third factor here is Uranus, which is in hexagram 24, line 6. So this is part of the Ajna center, or the third eye center here in the sort of the mind, and it's in the central channel, which is kind of switched on in the Bitcoin chart. And this is a great channel for getting kind of downloads or those sudden hits of inspiration, or kind of aha moments where we make decisions seemingly on the fly, but they are very intuitively accurate, almost like a bolt of lightning. And I think that's very fitting, with Uranus. And being placed in hexagram 24, we are talking about getting over the past, because past missteps here can limit your range of choices, and sort of, as I say, interfere with decision making, and that's going to be really, really important kind of going forward. As I was saying, when it comes to the luminaries, that it's very important to get in touch with our inner authority, because this is the route to courage and to acting with conviction. So it's really, really important to sort of center yourself, to ground yourself, do whatever is required to do that, whether it's meditation or exercise or whatever the case may be, to make choices distraction free, and to make them from a place that is kind of natural to you, so that it is kind of when you are playing to your strengths, really. So part of this is learning to relax and not being intellectually stubborn. So, sometimes the mind can really get in the way of our decision making, particularly if we do have, say, sacral authority, which is all about gut instinct, or splenic authority, which is about intuition, or indeed emotional authority, which is very much about, making decisions from the heart, in the sense of the sort of the emotional body. So it's very important to really kind of get to know what your authority is, your center of authority, and to learn to sort of develop a language with it so that you can make better decisions and get clearer kind of answers from your internal guidance system. And in that sense, yes, on paper, maybe something looks as though it'll never happen, or we sort of, I think we've all experienced that, where we like the science says one thing, or tradition says one thing, and in our gut we just feel as though things are not going to go like that. Something has shifted, something has changed, and we kind of want to take a risk, but then our mind gets the better of us and we sort of held back, and then afterwards we can kind of kick ourselves because it does actually play out the way that we thought it would. So I think, as I say, it's a time of change. Certainly April is an interesting month. We've got a blue moon, sort of eclipse at the end of the month, and so we're going to be moving into a new 6-month cycle. And I think it's going to be important that that we kind of see this as a kind of transition time when lots is shifting and changing, and we're really shifting gears, moving into a new year-long solar cycle, etc., etc. And so even though we seem to be in the 3rd month of the year from a kind of calendar point of view, we're actually in the 1st month of the year as far as astrology is concerned, because it follows the agricultural calendar, which many countries still kind of follow. So I think just that's a kind of, I think, setting us up for what we're going to see in the actual chart itself of Bitcoin. So here we've got the new moon chart, which is transposed onto the Bitcoin chart, and we can see the sun and the moon at 11 degrees or so of Aries. They appear to be on the midheaven, but actually they are still in the 9th house of the chart. Now the 9th house in the Bitcoin chart is very much associated with higher education and learning, foreign travel, foreign relations, publishing, as well as things like the law and cultural phenomena. So our kind of cultural beliefs, our spiritual beliefs, our ethics and morals, that kind of thing. So I think it is interesting that this is where the Aries sun and moon are going to be, because obviously Bitcoin Miami will be kind of taking place a couple of days after this new moon. So very much keying into this energy, and of course certainly from a London perspective, this would be considered to be overseas. The Bitcoin chart is set for London, and Miami would certainly be considered to be foreign in that sense. So I think that's super interesting. We've also got Mercury, as I said, in the mix, which we talked about earlier, and you can see it here at 9 degrees or so of Aries. So it's coming off of the Bitcoin moon, which I talked about last time, and I think what's super interesting is that it is making a square, I think, to the Bitcoin sun, but at the same time what's interesting is that Uranus is going to be making a trine to the Bitcoin sun. So we've got conflicting energies kind of pointed, if you like, at the chart ruler of Bitcoin. So these are both very important aspects, and if we kind of break them down, starting with Mercury, in the Bitcoin chart, Mercury rules the 12th house of what's hidden, or sometimes it could be secret enemies, or what's going on behind the scenes that we don't really know about. And it also rules the 2nd house of price here, because Virgo is the 2nd house cusp ruler of the Bitcoin chart. So it does stand to affect price action potentially, and I'm not really sure what these potential machinations might be. The Bitcoin Mercury is in an interesting place in the natal chart. It's very close to the ascendant, the descendant, and not far off from the Bitcoin Jupiter. And of course, this is, generally speaking, it's a position associated with kind of main players or key players, significant relationships, that kind of thing, in terms of Bitcoin. So it might have something to do with ongoing developer issues. It could have something to do with Bitcoin mining, although I'm not entirely convinced that that's what it would be, because I would expect it more to have something to do with Venus. But it certainly seems to have something to do with the sort of the health or the everyday the day-to-day kind of running or functioning of Bitcoin. And as I say, you know, this other element of like a foreign entity or a foreign power. Now, of course, Russia is talking about using or accepting Bitcoin as payments for gas and oil, and of course that's kind of a sort of an interesting one, a bit of a sort of an ethical minefield, because although a lot of countries and institutions have banned any kind of dealings with Russia, the European Union, for example, has not, because they need Russian gas and oil to keep Europe running. Otherwise, there's going to be a huge supply shock, and you know that's going to drive the price of oil up again. It's starting to fall. There's questions around Russia and whether they're going to default on their loan. There's sort of their foreign exchange, the foreign currency loans that, you know, they can't pay in dollars. They don't have any sort of dollars, so there is talk of, are they going to kind of default, because they're offering to pay in rubles, but nobody wants to accept rubles. So I mean, this could have some sort of negative impact, like an unforeseen impact on the market in general, and therefore on sentiment. But then on the positive side, as I said, we've got transiting Uranus moving towards that trine that I talked about last forecast with the Bitcoin sun. Now this is super, super, super positive. And I think it's super interesting because, as I say, it will reach exactitude around about the 3rd or the 4th of April. This is smack bang in the middle of Bitcoin Miami, where I think a lot of sentiment is going to be quite high, certainly amongst the Bitcoin kind of loyalists and hardliners. On top of that, we've got some interesting developments that I think are also linked to Uranus. So first of all, Terra they kind of announced back in January, in sort of late January, that they were purchasing about $10 billion worth of Bitcoin to sort of act as a store of value, to kind of back up their stablecoin, which is UST, I think. And so they've been buying since late January, and this is more or less the time when Uranus turned direct. So it went direct around about the 18th or so of January. And they've apparently been buying about sort of 8,000 to 9,000 Bitcoins sort of almost every day for the last 3 months. And certainly that's potentially affecting price, sort of on top of which we have a little bit of a supply shock going on, because a lot of what do you call it, the on-chain analysis from people like Will Clementi and who's the other chap that Pumped often interviews, also called Will. I can't remember his, no, is it Darren Sinclair, or I can't remember his name. But anyway, both of them were talking about how a lot of Bitcoin has been moved off exchanges into people's private wallets. There's been a lot of long-term holding, and so and miners are hanging on to their coins as well. So it is creating a little bit of a supply shock, and it's interesting that Venus is applying to the Bitcoin Venus here in the 7th house, and I do think that points to, you know, mining, because Venus does rule the 4th house, you know, in the Bitcoin chart. And as I've said before, Venus is definitely the wealth maker. So I think it'll be interesting to see what happens towards the end of April, beginning of May, when she's kind of she moves into the sign of, she ingresses into Pisces, which is then going to hit this Bitcoin Venus, and we could very well see a new all-time high as a result. So I think that's something to kind of watch for from mid-April kind of onwards. But certainly, I mean, in the short term, I think we are definitely in for a short squeeze, and that will be probably quite sudden, possibly a little bit violent, thanks to Uranus. As I say, it is applying to the sun, and this is very, very bullish, especially with that trine. So I think that's something to sort of watch for over the coming days. On top of which, we've got a couple of other things going on. So transiting Jupiter is currently moving through the sign of Pisces, and as I've said before, this does tend to sort of coincide with downtrends in terms of the stock market. And of course, there is still a very strong link between what happens particularly on Wall Street and in the cryptocurrency space. So transiting Jupiter is going to be applying to Neptune, which is of course the natal ruler, or the natural ruler, if you like, of Pisces, and it's going to do so in the 8th house. You can see these two planets here, and they're only within about 2 degrees of each other. So this is going to happen in mid-April, around about the 12th or so. And I think this is going to be super, super interesting. So it's applying to the Bitcoin Uranus here in the 8th house. And of course, Uranus rules this 7th house. So for me, it is all about, investors, which is why it's transiting kind of form, the form that's kind of moving with the movement of the planets. Where I think that trine is going to be super important. Now, what's interesting about this Uranus is that it's sitting in the 8th house, and this is the house of kind of shared resources, and as I've said before, it tends to be about derivative type funds. So funds where people can buy into, where they can either invest in, say, staked Bitcoin, or where they can invest in by buying shares into, say, an ETF, some kind of derivative that is sort of backed up by Bitcoin as the kind of the collateral asset. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of happens. I mean, with Terra, that is exactly what they are doing. They are essentially buying Bitcoin as a store of value. It's not just sort of like buy and sell it on the open market. Their idea is to kind of hodl it and to use it as digital gold, like an asset that they can use to underpin their stablecoin UST, so that it maintains a stable value, much as some other stablecoins are kind of pegged to the US dollar. So I think this could be pivotal. It's almost like we're reaching critical mass on a number of levels in terms of the astrology, and at the same time it's being reflected in the outside world with the fact that, as I say, Terra's been buying Bitcoin since the 18th of January. At the same time, there's less and less Bitcoin available on the open market to buy, and that is creating a lot of demand, and that tends to be reflected in terms of price. And I think Pomp was saying that we haven't seen these kind of conditions since around about September of 2020, which is just before we had that parabolic move up, kind of reaching that new all-time high in December of 2020. So a lot of people saying very similar conditions are kind of falling into place, and so I do think that we should prepare ourselves for potentially quite a parabolic move up. Now, whether it's sustained or whether we then kind of go down a bit and then sort of range, I think remains to be seen. What is interesting is transiting Saturn, which is also kind of moving through the 7th house of the Bitcoin chart. And for me, this is about regulation, but it's also for me about stable coins. And I mentioned this right back in my first post about Bitcoin in, I think, January of 2020 or 2021, when I kind of talked about how I thought that Saturn represented stable coins. And we are kind of seeing a lot of institutions very, very interested either in investing in stable coins themselves or in ventures that are backed up by stablecoin. So I think this could be super interesting too, because Saturn is applying to the Bitcoin Neptune, and generally speaking, this helps to stabilize Neptune, because Neptune very often is, like we saw back in September of 2021, Neptune can create leaks, it can create security, like holes in security. It does tend to lead to loss, through this kind of leaking. So I think with Saturn coming up to this position, which incidentally rules the 8th house cusp, so it is also important here, I think that should really kind of help to stabilize the market. So institutional investors kind of coming in and buying to hold, much the same as in December 2020 when MicroStrategy and some others bought, I think it was the Grayscale Trust. They bought with this idea of not selling, of buying sort of assets that they would then sort of hold long term. So in that sense, it'll be interesting to see what kind of happens if other institutional players come into the market, or if we get legislation that helps to legitimize Bitcoin more in the eyes of investors, and kind of gives them the green light to sort of like all pile in, now that they know that they can reassure their investors, that it's not sort of the wild wild west where they're going to lose their money. The only caveat I would add here is transiting Mars, and that is it's coming off of the Bitcoin Chiron. Now, Mars is interesting because it does rule the midheaven of the Bitcoin chart, so it is really important in terms of foot on the gas, let's move forward with conviction and courage, like we saw with the human design transits. But at the same time, it is a malefic, and we do have to bear that in mind, and it can represent war, you know. So I think, you know, maybe the uncertainty around that was created through this kind of Russia-Ukraine situation starting to ease off as Mars moves off of Chiron, which does tend to point to vulnerabilities, and in this case the vulnerability being a kind of a weakened sentiment due to sort of fear and uncertainty. But it is going to then apply to the Bitcoin Neptune, and that could be a little bit more tricky. So we'll have to see what happens, particularly once we get to the full moon, I think, and Mars has kind of moved on. I think we'll have a better idea of what that could mean. But this Jupiter in Pisces applying to Neptune, I do think that it's an interesting one because, as I say, it is going to kind of, the combination is an interesting one. Jupiter tends to amplify, and Neptune tends to dissolve or kind of dilute. So it'll be interesting to see which of the two planets wins out when they kind of combine their energies. Do we get an amplification of dilution and loss, or do we get a kind of like this epiphany, if you like, that you know, but say Bitcoin is kind of the way to go, or people suddenly understanding the value of investing in a Bitcoin fund, or I mean, there's also been talk about people paying tax in crypto, like in states like Florida, although, I mean, as Pomp kind of said, the likelihood of that happening is probably quite slim, because a lot of those people who kind of understand Bitcoin understand that it's not really something that you want to sort of like use for currency on a kind of ongoing basis, because you're not allowing for enough time for appreciation in value. But I mean, it'll be interesting to see what happens, because of course that sets off the opposition to Saturn, and you know, as we saw back in September, this can cause problems. So, for example, it could also have something to do with, say, for example, what happens in Russia or China. You know, I mean, the Evergrande situation started to unravel around about September. So, about 6 months ago, when we had our last equinox, and therefore, you know, I think the correlation between the 2 points needs to really be taken into consideration, you know, because the sun is back at the same position now. It's just on the other side of the horizon, if you like, the other side of the zodiac. And so, you know, it'll be interesting to see if something happens with regards to Evergrande, and that could potentially be a bit of a downer for the market as a whole, because it does tend to affect sentiment, and particularly Chinese buyers and sellers. You know, liquidity suddenly, you know, they either need to sort of suddenly sell to get liquidity because they can't use their other kind of assets, or they need to pay off debts, or whatever the case may be. So you suddenly could get selling pressure kind of happening. So it'll be interesting to see, but my overall feeling is that this is pretty bullish. We've got quite a lot of very positive aspects, including this trine to the Bitcoin ascendant, which is, again, it's almost the same as the Bitcoin sun. You know, it's kind of the first house of Bitcoin, and therefore it represents almost the whole chart. It's the sort of the identity of Bitcoin. So the fact that it's the new moon is keying into that, I think, suggests definitely a bullish 2 weeks, upcoming 2 weeks, particularly, as I say, around about April 3 and 4, when we get that exact trine between Uranus and the sun. Now, moving on to Ethereum, this is even more interesting for different reasons. So this particular new moon happens at the other side of the chart. It's now kind of in the more kind of private sphere of the fourth house of the Ethereum chart, which points to fundamentals. And it's so interesting because I think its guide at Coin Bureau has just done a video about Ethereum 2.0, which apparently is now not going to be called ETH 2.0, it's going to be called Ethereum, so that nobody gets confused. But they are in the process of continuing or accelerating their sort of upgrade timetable. So that is I think going to be good news, because Ethereum is gradually moving away from proof of work to proof of stake. There are several steps in the process, and I will link to Guy's video because he explains it all step by step really, really well. But I think it is generally going to be quite bullish for Ethereum, you know, because it gives Ethereum better green credentials, which I think is absolutely what do you call it? Music to the ears of investors who are already interested in Ethereum because of stable coins. You know, most stable coins run on the Ethereum network, and a lot of institutions who are risk averse see this as a better option to Bitcoin. There's less volatility with Ethereum, and obviously the less risk involved, I think the better. So if they can sell this idea of green credentials on top of everything else, it's all kind of looking really, really positive. Now, I do think that with the new moon approaching the Uranus in the 5th house, that this could be really, really bullish for kind of NFTs and the NFT market. I mean, that is already kind of quite manic, but I think, you know, it could reach a new peak of mania once it kind of gets there. But that won't happen immediately. So the moon will get to Uranus first because it travels a lot faster, and that happens around about the 2nd of April. So just before this, Uranus gets to 13 degrees for Bitcoin, and as we know, if Bitcoin moves, Ethereum will usually follows. So that's going to be, I think, quite bullish. And then the Sun gets to Uranus around about the 10th of April, which is just before the Jupiter-Neptune conjunction that happens, which is quite a big deal because these two planets move quite slowly. So it's quite a rare event, actually. And that will happen in the Ethereum 4th house, so again affecting fundamentals. So I think this is also going to be very, very bullish for Ethereum. You know, Jupiter and Neptune in the 4th is an interesting one. Jupiter rules, first of all, the Ethereum ascendant, which is actually at 0 degrees of Sagittarius, and Neptune rules the 3rd house. No, it doesn't. It rules the IC. That's interesting. Yes. So in other words, the 4th house of fundamentals. So the combination of the two is almost like the combining of the roots of Ethereum with the sort of fundamental identity of Ethereum. So it's very fitting that we have this idea of a kind of a migration over to a new kind of mainnet, and this reinvention, this rebirth, if you like, of Ethereum 2.0. So I think that fits very well in terms of the symbolism, actually. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens when we get to this Jupiter-Neptune conjunction on April the 12th, especially with the Bitcoins, I mean, with the Sun reaching this Ethereum Uranus. It could be very, very, I think we could get some really good news around sort of NFTs and what can be done with NFTs, that kind of thing. Some big media announcement, maybe a new fund, or people announcing how much money they've managed to raise in an Ethereum-backed sort of like venture, that kind of thing. Or it could have something to do with an exchange, because the 3rd house can also be about exchanges, some big purchase, something like that. But maybe we get sort of a record purchase of an NFT at that time. But I think it could be very, very bullish for Ethereum. So those are key dates to watch. But returning to this particular new moon and the sort of the key kind of planetary indicators. So the luminaries, as I say, are going to be trying. They're going to be trying the Ethereum Sun. That's also important. So the Ethereum Sun in Leo sits in the 8th house. And I've said this before, I kind of think it's interesting that we haven't had an Ethereum fund of any kind, really, in terms of like a listed fund, you know, like an ETF or that kind of thing. I would really be surprised if we didn't hear some kind of news involving some kind of new fund that investors could kind of get involved in, some institutional fund that's sort of being set up behind the scenes. And it may also have something to do with a country, because we are talking about the Sun rules the 9th house cusp in the Ethereum chart. So it may have to do with a foreign country. I mean, imagine a foreign country choosing to kind of adopt Ethereum as like a currency, or maybe some kind of, like, imagine a higher institution deciding that they were going to accept Ethereum as like a form of payment for, say, tuition fees or something of that ilk. Or publishing, I think, is another big area where there's definitely a crossover with NFTs. A lot of people have started to look at sort of publishing books as NFTs, so there could be kind of some overlap there. But again, it's a very bullish sort of indicator, and I think one to kind of to bear in mind. The only downside about the Jupiter-Neptune conjunction is that there could be a little bit of confusion around this upgrade. A lot of people don't really seem to understand entirely like how it's going to unfold and what it could mean. And there have already been some problems related to kind of token swap scammers and that kind of thing, who are using the ETH 2.0 name, the brand name, to sort of fool people into thinking that they are swapping their kind of ETH, their old ETH tokens for new ones, and when actually it's kind of like just people trying to sort of like hoover up their coins. And that's one of the reasons why Vitalik and co have decided not to maintain the brand name of ETH 2.0. The ETH Foundation, the Ethereum Foundation, has decided to eradicate that. But they could, there's still some unsuspecting people out there who won't necessarily know this. So this is creating sort of a bit of a problem. And of course there are migration problems to sort out as well, which can affect security. So, teething problems that I think still need to be sorted. And this, I think, could possibly be kind of indicated by the square that we've got between the Moon, the Sun, Mercury, and this Ethereum Pluto here at 13 degrees or so. So Chiron and is also part of the stellium, and Chiron is probably closest to Pluto, so leading this square. But all of these planets are then going to sort of square Pluto here, and Pluto rules the 12th house in the chart. So this can point to sort of nefarious players, people, as I say, that do want to take advantage of ignorance by kind of green investors, that kind of thing. So I think really something to be careful about over the next couple of months as this upgrade happens, so that you aren't kind of caught short, because this Pluto does sit in the second house of price. So if enough people get scared and don't want to are afraid of what this upgrade could mean, or kind of get wrong information, it can lead to a price kind of dip. So yeah, just something to bear in mind. And then I suppose the other key transit is that the Ethereum Neptune will be sextiling Uranus. So transiting Uranus here in the 6th house of the Ethereum chart. And this is, as I said, is bullish for Bitcoin. Uranus turned direct. It was retrograde for most of the second half of 2021, and then it turned direct on around about the 18th of January, as I said, and started to move back towards the pot of fortune. Now, it's so interesting for me that the Ethereum pot of fortune and the Bitcoin pot of fortune are almost in the same place, and that's quite rare actually, because it's based on a kind of a ratio between the ascendant, the sun, and the moon, I think. So it's quite unusual to get a similar pot of fortune, and I think that's maybe why Ethereum and Bitcoin are so closely linked in terms of, the fate of the one seems to also be the fate of the other. So I think as I've said before in other videos, as Uranus reaches 18 degrees or so of Taurus, I do think that we will see all-time highs in the market, like potential tops, which I think happens in around about June. So I think that's kind of something to watch out for, to look out for. But in the shorter term, Uranus is going to be making a trine, as I said, to first of all to that Pluto here in the second house. So that's a kind of a nice bullish counter indicator to these squares, although the squares will happen first because the planets move faster. Uranus moves a lot slower, so you might have a kind of maybe a fake out followed by quite a strong bullish breakout further on, and on top of that, as I say, Uranus also making the sextile to Neptune in the 3rd house. And I think this is what gives Ethereum its kind of dreamy, kind of rainbow unicorn type of vibe. The 3rd house is a lot about kind of brand, name, marketing, self-expression, that kind of thing. So I think that's it'll be interesting to see what kind of happens in those terms, in branding terms, when we get to that point. That I think certainly good news and good publicity, perhaps about the upgrade. I think if they start to sort of really publicize it and show the virtues of what this could mean for Ethereum long term. I mean, they're talking about reducing, for example, the amount of coins that gets sort of mined or kind of minted. I don't know what the correct term is for it. It will reduce quite drastically, and that could very well create a rise, quite a massive rise in price, sort of ultimately, because there'll be less ETH available to buy, simply. So creating sort of like a supply shortage. So that could be interesting, and then, as I say, there's this whole kind of issue around green credentials, which I think is going to play to Ethereum's strength. So yeah, I mean, it could also have something to do with the nuts and bolts of the upgrade over the next few months, as I say, because this does move very slowly. This is the sixth house of kind of health and day-to-day kind of workings, if you like. So it may have something to do with sharding and ETH layer 2 upgrades, which obviously would also have a positive effect on any layer 2 apps and smart contracts, that kind of thing, so applications. So yes, but I think ultimately, you know, bullish long term for Ethereum. So looking very positive, I think, Ethereum overall, and one to kind of watch, I think, over the next few weeks. I think it's going to be quite a bullish time for the DeFi space over the next, well, certainly over the next month. So that's kind of it from me. I hope you've enjoyed this forecast. I didn't want to make it too long. If you are interested in looking back at some of the other blog posts that I've done, you can always visit the Astro Insights blog, and I do sort of I will be posting the new eclipse forecasts sort of as we get to kind of mid-April, so that's going to be something to look out for, because as I say, we are starting a new cycle, 6-month cycle, when we get to the end of April. So keep an eye on my my Twitter feed and my blog for sort of future announcements about those forecasts, because they are a bit longer term, and I know people really enjoyed the long-term forecasts that I made back in, when was it, November of 2021. They found it quite useful. So yes, look out for that, and yes, but anyway, enjoy. I hope that you kind of enjoy what looks like it's going to be a very bullish time for the space, and yes, I'll see you in a couple of weeks for my full moon forecast.